in a smooth, steady but cost-efficient way. And we are representing all technologies of renewables in all sectors, meaning electricity, heating and cooling, and transport, and of course all sources. Professor Sayek described them: wind, solar, bioenergy, geothermal, and hydro. And maybe it's worth mentioning the association this year will celebrate the 21st anniversary. So we were founded 21 years ago, and already when the association was founded, there was an agreement that the target, at that time we did not say in which year, but the target should be 100% of renewable energy for Germany's electricity supply. So I said it's good to know the potentials are there, but for guidance we need targets, and we need, of course, policies, instruments for implementation. For the example of Germany, I just give you a few of the figures. There are official targets, partly in policy programs, policy papers issued by the government, partly even put in a law. The electricity targets, which I show you here, they are all legally binding because they are put into the renewable energy law. And for this first slide, I went back in the past a little bit, because it is quite interesting that particularly in renewable electricity in the past, we have always had a phase when we were discussing targets. People were saying, oh guys, you are too ambitious, this can't be done. And then it was done a few years earlier. So for instance, back in 2000, and at that time, Ali Sayek was mentioning that I was working in the German Ministry for the Environment as a Director General for Renewables and others. We were discussing a target for 2010. In 2000, we were discussing a target for 10 years ahead. And at that time, after a long discussion, people said it's not feasible, it's just crazy. There was an agreement, let's try to reach 12.5% of Germany's electricity from renewables in 2010. That target effectively was reached in 2008, and end of 2010 we were at around 18%. Now we are at 20%. So definitely this is feasible. Then there was a target of 20% for 2020, which was agreed also in 2010. Meanwhile, the target, the official government target, is 35% for 2020. And as I said, 20% is exactly where we were at the end of 2011. So this would not be an ambitious target. We, the industry associations, those who are advocating renewables, we believe that by 2020, so nearly 10 years from now, we should be able to produce more or less half of Germany's electricity from renewables. But of course, as I said, this does not happen by itself. It will only happen if the political framework is correct, and this is why it is so important to have good policies for renewables. I think I can proudly say that in Germany, for the electricity sector, with our renewable energy law, we have something which I would really say is a good policy example. And this is why I put you here some of the main features of this renewable energy law, which in today's shape entered into force in 2000. And there are 5 major principles in this law. And this is something which I can only recommend for all regions and all countries of the world to copy for their legislation. Of course, the exact costs are different and the resources are different in all countries, but I think there can be some guiding principles for how to promote, how to support renewables. One thing is that in the law, there is a guarantee for every producer of renewable electricity to feed the electricity into the grid and to get paid for that electricity. There is a guarantee for a specific payment for these installations, normally for a period of 20 years, but it's not the same for all renewables. There is a differentiation. When the law came into force, solar by far was the most expensive one, and the remuneration was around 50 euro cents per kilowatt hour. Meanwhile, solar is down to 18, 19 euro cents per kilowatt hour. To give you a comparison, this is less than than an average consumer pays to the electricity utility. A German consumer pays about 23, 24 euro cents per kilowatt hour to the utility. So the costs for solar are already below that. The next principle of this law was do not continue a certain level of support forever, but bring the costs down. This is why from the very beginning in this law there was a regulation saying this year you get, for instance, 20 euro cent, next year it is less. And again, according to the different technologies, for wind and hydro and biomass, normally the decrease is 1% per year. For other technologies, which are still younger and less developed, like for instance offshore wind energy, for instance, this is 5% per year, and solar, there are degression rates around 15 and more percent per year, because the costs are coming down so quickly. And of course, this law has to be revised regularly every 2, 3, 4 years, so that we can see whether it is still effective, whether there is overcompensation, etc., etc. And now, meanwhile, everybody, particularly after the Fukushima catastrophe, when the German government and parliament unanimously decided to completely phase out the use of nuclear energy by 2020, the discussion has begun how to transform the electricity system towards a system which is based on renewables as the major energy source. In this context, let me just mention the targets, the official government targets for the coming years. And if I say, I quote the official government targets, this is because I think it's always good not to overshoot ambition, because we as industry, we know what can be delivered. Governments and parliamentarians are always a little bit more cautious. So their target is, on the one hand, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% in 2020 and 80 to 95% in 2050, which is, by the way, at least this high figure for 2050 is more or less a universal consensus among climate scientists, and it's agreed in the United Nations. But of course, thinking of more or less completely cutting carbon emissions in the industrialized countries. This is applying for them. The developing countries have less. This is challenging. But still, we believe that this can be done, and this can be done particularly with very, very high shares of renewables. And so the government set up targets for final energy consumption, starting relatively low at 18% in 2020. For comparison, today we are at 12, and reaching for 60% by 2050. Again, we, the Renewables Associations, believe in 2050 it should be feasible with good policies to have all the energy in Germany coming from renewable energy sources. And there are specific targets for renewable electricity, which is easier to harvest on the one side, and where the technologies are further developed. And there the official government target is 35% for 2020, reaching to 80% by 2050. Again, I believe some years before 2050 we should have reached 100% in that, but only with good policies. The next few, well, and not to forget, after Fukushima, and I think this really was a landmark decision, the German government decided to phase out this form of electricity, nuclear, which had really no acceptance in Germany. Maybe the opposition against nuclear is stronger in Germany than in other countries, but I see that at least in some European countries, and of course in Japan, and in parts of the US, and in many parts of the world, people are wondering whether we should really take the risk, particularly because we have such well-developed alternatives which are clean and which are not dangerous. So this is renewables. Now, the next 4 or 5 slides are just pictures showing you the statistical development where we are with the different technologies in Germany. What you see there, that in the last 10 years in final energy consumption, we reached 20% now, as I said already, up from 7.8 10 years ago. That was electricity. For Heating, it's 10.4% today, up from 4.3 in 10 years ago, before. In transport, which is biofuels, we are only at 5.6%, which is disappointing, but which has a lot to do with policies not so good. And in final energy, I said this, we are at 12% now, striving for 18 in 2020 and more beyond. Let me just show you a few developments in technology. This is electricity generation, the renewables part of electricity generation. What you see there on the bottom, coming from 1990 until today, there is a solid base of hydro, mostly small hydro in Germany. There is still a little potential, but this is mostly developed. Germany is a densely populated country. Then we have a strong increase, this is the light blue, in wind energy. We have a strong increase in various forms of biomass. This is the green part. And you see the yellow part, which is solar energy, where the increase started more or less in the last 3 or 4 years. I show you this by technology. This is the development of wind energy up to nearly 30,000 megawatts of installed capacity end of last year, producing 45,000 gigawatt hours of electricity, or 45 million kilowatt hours. So this is really something. Solar PV, solar photovoltaics. We have now 25 megawatts of installed capacity in Germany, and in 2012 it seems that photovoltaics will overtake wind. We expect another 8 to 10 gigawatts to be installed this year, so photovoltaics also is very successful. Same for bioenergy, just to show you this curve. Heating and cooling, I mentioned this because there at the end of the graph you see a little slowdown. This has something to do, and a lot to do, with the fact that in difference to the electricity sector, where we really have a good law for heating and cooling, this is not the case. We only have support programs which are discussed again and again in the parliament, so there is no stable framework. Nevertheless, solar heating is growing, geothermal heating is growing, and this is the picture for road transport, just to show you again there. We had a good increase until 2007, when we had tax exemptions for bioenergy, for biofuels. Then there was a system change, and there was a breakdown. Now it's consolidating at a level, I think we will reach something like 8 or 9% in 2020, but still the most successful part of renewable energy is electricity. And not to forget, greenhouse gas reductions are one of the major, let me say, side effects, one of the major benefits. Only in 1 year, in 2011, about 129 million tons of CO2 equivalents were avoided. This is the major share of what Germany has to avoid according to the Kyoto Protocol. Now, let me, the second part, which is a bit shorter, on the European context. I said already, Germany is not an island country, but Germany is an integrated part of the European Union. And this has the advantage, on the one hand, Germany can be influenced by the European Union if there is a consensus for good policies, and of course Germany can have some influence in the European Union to develop renewable energy. So in 2007 there was a broad agreement among the heads of state and government of all 27 EU member states on several more or less ambitious targets for 2020, and this agreement was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 20% compared to 1990, or maybe even 30% if others do the same. And again, this reduction target of 80 to 90% by 2050. There was an agreement to increase energy efficiency by 20% in 2020. And the major part and the strongest piece of legislation which was developed then was the agreement. Renewable energy must be a major part of this, and all over Europe we must have a share of 20% renewables in 2020, and this was underpinned by legally binding legislation. This legislation was the Renewable Energy Directive, which entered into force in 2009. So this is legislation in Europe, and now I come to statistics in Europe. What you see there is the growth, is the added capacity, the annually added new electricity capacity in Europe, starting in 1995, ending in 2000. Well, this is new capacity. This is not gross, this is net new capacity. What you see there is, and this part which is something like gray, which I call RES, which is increasing from 1995 up to 2011, is the renewable energies, all forms of renewable energies. And what you see is that particularly starting in 2000, 2002, wind energy was a major part of all new installations. There always is, this is the yellow part, there is natural gas. This always has a high share of new installations. Then starting in 2005, 2006, solar energy became visible. And last year, in 2011, 71 gigawatts of new capacity, 71% of the new electricity capacity in Europe was from renewables. You see that number on top of the last column. The major part of it, for the first time ever, the major part of it from solar, then gas and wind. Gas is not renewable, but gas and wind shared the second place. So ever since 2008, the major share of new electricity capacity all over Europe, not only in the front-runner countries, all over Europe, was from renewables. Projection, just to give you an idea where we could be in 2020, which is only 8 years from now. According to government projections, we could have 20.7% in overall consumption, and we could have about 34% in electricity all over Europe. We could have 21 in heating and cooling and 11 in road transport. According to our projections as renewables associations, this could be a little bit higher, 42% for electricity, 23 for heating and cooling, and 12 for transport. The first evaluation, and I won't go into detail of this slide, but a first evaluation of the progress achieved since this new directive entered into force. So more or less the agreement on targets in 27 until now. So end of last year, 2011, all governments had to write reports on their success, on their growth of renewables in the last few years. And what we can see from these reports is that nearly all 27 EU member states are really on the way forward to their targets. Most of them are already beyond their intermediate targets foreseen for 2012. So end of 2010, the majority of the European member states had already reached a higher share of renewables than foreseen for 2020. This is quite important. So at present in the European Union, and I think this is quite important because this is a process comprising all member states, comprising the European Commission, comprising the European Parliament, there is a discussion on a common vision for 2050. The European Commission has, end of last year, presented an energy roadmap 2050, which on the one hand tries to deliver on the decarbonization targets, which discusses milestones for 2030, 2040, where to be in renewables development, in greenhouse gas reduction, and for the first time, and I think this is very important, the Commission is starting to discuss how to change the energy markets so that they are really compatible with renewables. Insofar, until now, discussions in industrialized countries mostly are, we, the renewables people, are being asked, you have to integrate into the existing system. And meanwhile, at least the question has come up, is this really the right way? But don't we have to adapt the energy system to the best possibility to integrate high shares of renewables? For that purpose, the European Commission has calculated several scenarios. I won't go into detail today. This I will do tomorrow in the workshop. I will explain a little bit on which scenarios they calculated, how they calculated. For today, I think it should be enough that in all these scenarios, they have very, very high shares of renewables. they do not really dare to say 100% is the option, but for electricity they come close to 80%, and for the overall energy sector they come close to 60% in 2050. So I think for a scenario which has to be agreed on not only by the European Commission and by countries like Germany, who really go for 100 or close to 100%, or Denmark or others, but which also has to be applicable for countries like France, who until today rely on high shares of nuclear, or Poland, who rely on high shares of coal. So I think it's a milestone forward that the Commission calculated these scenarios, despite some flaws in it. Again, the next steps are being discussed. I'll explain that tomorrow in detail in the workshop, if we have the time for that. And now let me just, as a conclusion, give you a few ideas what I think are the next steps which will have to happen in Europe. And again, it's something where other countries, at least in principle, in theory, how to design policies can look at and maybe take some good ideas from. The first thing is, I do believe it is very important, now that we are in 2012, only 8 years from this 2020 target, that the existing legislation reaching these ambitious targets, supporting all forms of renewables in electricity, heating and cooling, and in transport, that this legislation is really implemented, and that people do not start, now that they see we are on track, that they do not start to downgrade their ambitions. So keep on track for ambitious targets. Another important thing is policymakers have to decide what they really want. Do they really want to go for renewables as the dominant shares of the energy system in the near future? Most policymakers say so, but then they must be clear and they must support this transition, and it does definitely not make sense to continue to support the old energy system, coal, nuclear, which definitely is not compatible with very high shares of renewables. Still, of course, national countries are sovereign and they can decide what to do, but on an economical basis, it does not make sense to subsidize renewables on the one hand and nuclear on the other hand, because this increases the costs and it's really a contradictory system. Third point, I think it's very important to strike a good balance between national and regional and local policies on the one side, and agreements in larger contexts like we have in the European Union. So it's good to have an ambitious target for the European Union, but how to exactly implement this has to be decided in the individual member states. Or comparing this to this region, I think it would be good to have an ambitious target for the UAE, but definitely implementation would have to take place in Ajman, in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, and in the other Emirates, according to their local economic, financial, social situations. But of course, it makes sense to have an agreement of where to go. And so I think that the International Renewable Energy Agency now has taken seat in the United Arab Emirates, should be an incentive for the whole region to strive for ever-increasing shares of renewables. Fourth point, I think where you already have energy markets and where these markets are not just replaced by monopolies, it does definitely make sense to develop these markets in a way that renewables can fairly compete. Costs are really telling the truth, including externalities. Markets have to be adapted, I mentioned that. And this is my concluding remark. I think it's good to have a vision. It's good to have a short-term target. But if you have nothing between a short-term target and a long-term vision, stakeholders, investors may think it all stops with a short-term target. This is why in Europe we believe it is very, very important, now that we have this 2020 target, now that we know we will reach the target and probably exceed it, it definitely makes sense to agree on the next step, the next 10 years, and this is a target for 2030. We, the Renewable Energy Associations in Europe, we have proposed that the 2030 target for renewables in all sectors, electricity, heating and cooling, and transport, should be 45%. Of course, this is open for debate, but this is our proposal. Europe should strive for 45% in renewable energy overall by the way, for the electricity sector, this would mean something close to 60 or 70%, depending on the individual scenarios. So thank you for your patience, and with that, I'm open for questions.
Okay. Thank you. I think we better defer the question and answer at the end. Okay. Is better. Okay, well, the next speaker is from Japan, and is going to talk about development of photovoltaic industry and program in Japan. Is Mr. Isawa Yukawa. He's at the moment is advisor to Kaysara Solar Group, but previously he was a senior managing officer. He held several positions in addition to his post, president of Kaysara Solar Corporation, director of solar industry in USA, Solar Corporation of China, Solar Corporation of Czech Republic, and Kaysara Fine Ceramic in Germany. He is vice president of Japan Solar Energy Association, vice president of ICES, and member of New Energy Committee, MITI, in Japan. We are delighted to have Mr. Okawa. Okay.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Professor Ari. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Isawa Yukawa. I'm so happy to be here today, thanks to the kind invitation through the Ajman municipality and planning development. My subject of today is development of photovoltaic industries and program in Japan. My topics are as shown over here. First, I must really appreciate your support and the donations at March 11 disaster last year as one of the Japanese. Later, I will show you some of the several slides. Unfortunately, the recovery process is still slow due to political poor decisions. However, I think this topic is not major today, but this is related with renewable energy issues because of the disaster at the same time of the nuclear disasters. Second, as you have already recognized, that the world PV market have made drastic changes since last year's second half. Third, Japanese PV market show a survival game, which was a leader in the industry. Fourth, I would like to touch on PV business model in order to win a survival game. Fifth, mission and responsibilities. This is some of the pictures which I just mentioned about the 3/11 disasters. Newspaper said 3/11 disaster was the largest one in Japan, showing magnitude 8.8, but it actually corrected to magnitude 9. This disaster is connected with 3 natural disasters, as you know. One is tsunami, the other one is earthquake, the other one is nuclear disasters. In this disaster, about 16,000 people died. Still 3,000 people are missing. It means almost 20,000 people are gone. About 383,000 homes and buildings were destructed. Economical loss is about $31 billion in terms of the company basis. This picture shows the earthquakes. Lots of destructed houses. At the same time, lots of fires. At this time, we had about 140 fires at the same time. This one is the tsunami pictures. I watch the TV every day and night, but cannot believe, we have no word to say, but you cannot believe that the high wave is about 40 meters. This is about maybe 10 meters. 40 meters high tsunamis came over. So all the houses and buildings, all went out. This is another disaster, nuclear Fukushima. Already Professor Ari mentioned, and Heinrich also talked about this. We have in Japan 54 nuclear power stations. Due to this accident, these 4 nuclear power stations at Fukushima were decided to be scrapped. As of today, the remaining 50 power stations are stopped due to the safety issue discussions still this is undergoing. But particularly, local people are completely against nuclear power stations because of this. Lessons from this 3/11 disasters. Just I want to make some comment about this. The people think, oh, it might be not so big issues, but don't underestimate what is happening. Japanese people are also watching the big waves. Oh, maybe it is okay, we are safe, but it was not actually. It was so big waves, so people cannot go away quickly enough. So evacuate very quickly to save your life. At the same time, we have a lot of questions and answers under consideration because of this.